Good morning. This is Sonia from An Enthusiastic Reader. I am here today to do a Friday Reads. So I'm going to talk about a few of the books I've recently finished, what I'm reading now, and what I may read in March for one or more of the many events that are happening in March. So let's just get started. The first book I'd like to talk about is a book called The Last Thing You Surrender by Leonard Pitts Jr. And I read this because many people on BookTube have read it and raved about it. I wanted to read something that was written relatively recently, but also covered a topic from the past. So I basically wanted to read an historical novel written by an African-American writer about African-American themes. It's a World War II novel. It starts on Pearl Harbor Day with a soldier who is white named George Simon, and he is in one of the ships that is hit when the Japanese raid Pearl Harbor. And he breaks his hip, and an African-American man who works in the kitchen comes by and realizes that he needs to try and save George. And his name is Eric Gordy. They call him Gordy through the novel. So Gordy saves George, and there are like a variety of very tenuous and terrifying moments when things are going their way and then they get set back, and he spends all this time trying to save George, who has a crushed, broken hip. And then unfortunately, at the very end, Gordy slips and falls overboard and dies. So George tells everyone he knows that this African-American man who worked on the ship saved his life. And so the Navy decides in all of its wisdom that in order to get more African Americans to actually sign up and fight in the war, that George and Gordy's widow, Thelma, who's also from the same town that George is from, Mobile, Alabama, that they should go on a tour together and just talk about this heroic partnership that they had, where a black man died to save a white man, and it would make more people want to sign up for the war. But he is told he has to break it to Thelma that they're going to do this. So he goes home and he has to go to her house, and her brother is there, and his name is Luther. And Luther hates all white people because when they were children, Luther witnessed his parents being lynched by people in the community for no good reason other than they thought he was too successful. And so Luther, of course, carries a very righteous anger about this. And Thelma does not want to go on the goodwill tour with George. And so it sets up these dynamic friendships or relationships between these characters, because George, who has always been quite racist and just raised that way, starts getting glimmers of how his thinking has been wrong all along. And so that's part of what the novel is about. The novel takes place on three fronts: the home front, the Pacific, and the European front, when Luther has to go fight in that war and are on that side of the world. So you get to see like so many things from the war from all different sides. Thelma works in a shipyard. She makes friends. They buy a car so that they don't have to ride the bus. It's a propulsive plot, and it keeps carrying you along. It feels like it could have been written actually in the 50s, because there are so many racial epithets that are on every single page that it, I guess, was natural during that time for people to use that language, but it's jarring to read now, and you never quite get used to seeing it on the page so many times. The names that they called African-American people and the Japanese, and just the hate and the anger that's in the language is very hard to deal with. But it was a good read, and I would definitely read more Leonard Pitts Jr. And I also follow him on Twitter, and he has a very great presence on Twitter, talking about, he's a newspaper writer, so he talks a lot about current events and bad things that are happening all the time. He's a good person to follow. The next book I want to talk about is The Long Fall by Walter Mosley, and this is the first book in a series. Leonard McGill is the name of the detective in this series. He's named Leonard because his father was a communist, but Leonard is not a communist. He just is trying to get through the days. He's got a lot of heavy backstory, a lot of enemies, and a lot of things that he did that maybe were not above board, but now he's an investigator. So he's really not afraid to cross lines of ethics and the law in order to solve cases for his clients. And also, he is in a very unhappy marriage and has several children, and he's not even sure if all of the children that he thinks or he's been told are his, but he loves them, he takes care of them, and his oldest son is getting into a big amount of trouble because Leonard is tapping his email and finding out that this son has a grudge and is going to act on it. So there is a case, there's his past, and then there's this conflict with his son, and all of these things converge together to tell. It's a very taut and tense story. There's a lot of danger, a lot of violence and fighting, and there's, he's in peril the whole time. So it was a quick read, and I'm so glad I read it because I've always heard of Walter Mosley, but I've never read any of his novels, and I would read just about anything he writes because he's got such a way with language and with describing and world building that I felt like it was very authentic. The next book I'd like to talk about is Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. This is a memoir about, it's about a lot of things, but she is a young musician. She grew up near Seattle. Her mother is Korean, her father is white, and Michelle herself has always felt like she didn't really fit into any particular group. And so she finds independent music, becomes a musician. In the meantime, she's having a lot of struggles and conflicts with her mother, as she always has. She just didn't understand her mother and thinks her mother doesn't understand her. And then she finds out her mother is dying of cancer. So she stops her tour and she goes to be with her mother as she's dying through the whole process. And along the way, Michelle kind of starts thinking about the foods that they ate. Her mother was a wonderful Korean cook. And so every single part of their lives to celebrate and to mourn involve these very intricate Korean dishes. And so Michelle tries to learn in various ways to learn how to cook these dishes. And she also goes home to Korea, so she connects with aunts and cousins and uncles and grandparents that live in Korea as well. So there's a lot of atmosphere in this, and you feel like you learn a lot about a culture you may have no knowledge of. You may have knowledge of it, but I had no knowledge of it, and I was just really drawn to this story. I started listening in an audiobook format. And a lot of times when I'm reading audiobooks like this, I get impatient and I decide just to get the text. And that's what ended up happening here. She did a good job of reading her own story, but I just wanted to read it faster than I could listen to it. So I went to the text, and I'm just really glad I read it. I felt like it did what it set out to do, and it made me feel for Michelle, and it made me feel for her parents too. So great memoir that everyone's raving about, and I agree. I read another not successful memoir, and I'm not going to talk about it too much because my point here isn't to bash books, but I read this for book club, and I certainly would have bailed on it if I didn't need to read it for book club, because it's a first-person memoir written by a woman whose mother has made her life a living hell, which I did feel a lot of empathy for everyone in the story involved. The name of the story is My Mother, Munchausen's, and Me, a true story of betrayal and a shocking family secret by Helen Naylor. Now, right off the bat, there is no shocking family secret because it's right in the title that the mother has Munchausen's. The woman, Helen, doesn't know this, and her father doesn't know this, and in fact, she's never diagnosed with it until very late in her life. It's not a secret because the woman's always thinking she's sick and is always in bed and always has headaches and uses her illness to manipulate and cajole and shame other people in her life because she wants attention. She's not really a villain though, because I feel like she had an undiagnosed mental illness and she never got treatment for it. She was never aware of, that we know of anyway, that this was something she was making up, that she wasn't really sick. There's never any broader look at how often Munchausen's is actually diagnosed, or is there a treatment? I mean, there was no context. There's no real medical context for it. It's just she finds out after her mother died that this was a diagnosis. So that was the shocking family secret. not a secret to all of us who had been reading all along the way. It was not successful because it was just more a litany. It was a kind of an anger memoir, and it was getting all the stories out, every slight and every incident that caused pain. Of course, you feel sympathy for the family, but it was very shallow. Currently, I am reading Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and Reconciliation by Maud Newton. This is a book that looks at genetics and tries to go deeper than genetics about what kinds of trauma and or family memories and or coping mechanisms may or may not get passed down through genes. And so the author talks a lot about examining her past and her family history through her own lens and seeing, and then doing all kinds of research about genetics and what is possible, twin studies, all these different things that I'm only halfway through, so I'm not there yet. And even goes into Carl Jung and collective unconscious, and seeing how all of this could affect a person and the choices they make based on genetics. And so really interesting. And her family history is fascinating. She's a very good writer and I'm really enjoying it, but I'm only halfway through. So I will talk about that later. And I'm still reading Best American Short Stories 2021, edited by Jessamine Ward. I'm reading that with Teresa. And this week we read a story called Love Letter by George Saunders. And it's interesting because it's an epistolary story. The whole story is told in this one letter from a grandfather to a grandson. And the date on the letter was February 22nd, which happened to be the date that we were reading the story, which is very serendipitous. And so I love this story. And even though there wasn't a lot of complexity to it, it was just a letter. But in the letter, you could tell that the grandfather was holding back on saying anything specific that could get people in trouble in case Homeland Security was reading the letter. And in this story, you kind of glean that the grandson has had a lot of friends or close people in his life that may be in trouble with immigration. It was a gut punch story because it felt so incredibly real and timely. It was written, it was published in the New Yorker in 2020, so it's a couple of years old. Who knows how long it was taking him to write this story. But it felt like he could have just been, whispering in my ear about all the things that are happening now, the terrible situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, and all of the bad things that are happening in Texas and Florida with bills that are trying to police and even criminalize gender expression that doesn't go along with what they expect or they feel comfortable talking about or accepting into their realm. It's terrible. Anyway, I mean, the story, okay, I found a passage that I'd like to read, and it's the essential realization that no one is coming to save us in essence. And I know we hear that a lot, but I thought that just hearing some of the writing might explain a little bit about this story. Every night, as we sat across from each other doing those puzzles, from the TV in the next room blared this litany of things that had never happened, that we could have never imagined happening, that were now happening, and the only response from the TV pundits was a wry satirical smugness that assumed, as we assumed, that those things could and would soon be undone, and that all would return to normal, that some adult would arrive, as they had always arrived in the past, to set things right. It did not seem, and please destroy this letter after you have read it, that someone so clownish could disrupt something so noble and time-tested and seemingly strong that had been with us literally every day of our lives. We had taken, in other words, a profound gift for granted, did not know the gift was a fluke, a chimera, a wonderful accident of consensus and mutual understanding. Because this destruction was emanating from such an inept source who seemed at that time merely comically thuggish, who seemed to know so little about what he was disrupting, and because life was going on, and because every day they burst through some new gate of propriety, we soon found that no genuine outrage was available to us anymore. So it sounds grim, and that is our reality, right? But at the end, there is a glimmer of hope in a kind of a wisdom from this grandfather to this grandson that we want to take action. We don't know what will happen. Our actions may not even help, and that we also still have to preserve ourselves and our sense of humanity and following our routines, because we still have to live life as long as we can and as long as we are able to. So I am putting a link to the New Yorker issue that has this story if you would like to read it, but it made me feel worse and it made me feel better. And so that is what I'm reading right now. The last thing I want to talk about is what I may read in March. For March of the Mammoths, I'm trying to decide whether to read the love songs of W.E.B. DuBois by Honoree. I get this name wrong and I don't mean to. The love songs of W.E.B. DuBois by Honoree Fanone Jeffers, or a true novel by Minae Mizumura. And this, it says, is a retelling of Wuthering Heights in a Japanese story. To me, it seems more a rags to riches story, maybe a little bit more David Copperfield, but I mean, I haven't read it, so I don't know. Now, this is 840 pages, so it counts as a mammoth. However, I mean, the font is large, the margins are large, and the leading, which is the lines between the lines of type, are large and ample. So I don't think that this is as long as it looks because of the way it's been typeset. This is me coming from a book design background, so I'm still going to count it as a mammoth if I read it, but I honestly don't. I'm questioning whether or not it's actually as long as something, say, as a Dickens novel, where everything is crammed on the page to maximize the space that we're given for the layout. So that's what I may read for March of the Mammoths. There's an Irish readathon for March. I probably won't follow those prompts, but I do love Irish literature, and I've had a couple of books sitting on my shelves for a long time, so I think I may try them. John Banville's The Sea, which is this luminous new novel about love, loss, and the unpredictable power of memory, which I feel is the thesis statement for every single novel I read. The unpredictable power of memory is kind of a core of storytelling, right? And this other one, which is called That They May Face the Rising Sun by John McGahern. And this one says that it's a couple that comes to Ireland from London in search of a different life. We are introduced with deceptive simplicity to a complete representation of existence. An enclosed world has been transformed into an everywhere, which seems like a lot to live up to, but if it actually comes true, it seems like an amazing novel based on that description. So I have never read John McGahern, and I have had this on my shelf probably for 15 years. And so it seems like the perfect time to pull it down and give it a try. So that's everything I have to talk about today. I hope you are doing well. Thank you for watching, and thank you for subscribing. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good weekend, and we all stay safe and strong, and I hope things go better on so many fronts. And that's it. I will see you in the next video. Bye.